What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I am on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Johanna Tysk, and we speak about object constellations and systemic thinking and what it has to do with facilitation. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you scroll down to the show notes and download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Johanna, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Miriam. Thank you so much.
I am curious just to witness what will emerge from our conversation.
And I'm also very curious to see what will emerge from this conversation.
I can see many different paths. And I'm grateful for Sarah Huang, who was on the show, who brought you to Never Done Before, and you facilitated an object constellation that left me in awe. So much to explore, and I'm happy to share that with the audience. And before we dig into the details, I always like to start with the uncomfortable question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator, and actually do you?
Yes. Okay. So, and actually the answer is no. I don't call myself a facilitator, but I've started thinking of myself as a facilitator more and more. I think like on my CV, I chose, because I have a lot of different titles to choose from in a way, and they've changed a lot over the years. But the most current version is systems thinker, social and organizational innovation strategist, educator, artist. But facilitator could be in there as well, because that's part of all these things. And it's become more and more, I think, part of my practice.
So for you, what makes a facilitator? So what is the difference between just using facilitation as a practice versus carrying the identity of being a facilitator?
That's really interesting. I think it goes back to even like, because if you're an educator, like it could be about like you're putting something out there, but a facilitator, it's like you facilitate a process of some sort. I'd say that for me, that would be the essence of facilitation, that you're holding space and you're creating conditions for a particular process to happen. Yeah, I would say that's facilitation. So you're not didactic in that sense. Like you can share knowledge, but then you leave space for people to integrate this knowledge and make it their own.
Which actually might also be the highest art of education, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally educators would be facilitators, but it's not always the case.
That's true.
But I think that's how it should be. And I think facilitation could be part of a lot of different practices in a way. I mean, I think that practice of holding space for other people's growth and understanding and like experience of something, I think it's needed in so many situations in a way, or for so many different processes to happen.
I agree. Even in the private space.
Yeah, sure.
And you have a background in transdisciplinary design.
Yes.
And I find this intriguing. And I would be curious, what kind of disciplines does this encompass? And how do you use this now today in all your different roles?
I'd say, transdisciplinary. I mean, I have my own relationship to different disciplines that I've engaged with on my journey that I somehow incorporate into my work, like art and creative expression of different sorts. I've explored a whole range of different creative expressions. I've moved into like innovation work, like that kind of facilitating processes where you can understand a particular problem or issue in new ways, or understand it in more holistic ways and find paths forward across different perspectives. And I mean, I've studied part of that. It's like, I've studied it's like if you look at my library here, it's like stuff from philosophy, psychology, like performance studies, like the social sciences. But also I have like, there's physics and chaos theory. And like, I mean, I think systems thinking is what's sort of become the core of what I do. And systems thinking is the most transdisciplinary practice there is, or theory. Like it really draws from all the different sciences.
And what would be the nutshell or your definition of systems thinking? Just to get an understanding so that we are talking about the same things.
Systems thinking, let's see, a short definition. I would say it's about seeing, like looking for holistic ways of understanding a particular issue. So you're not just looking at sort of the symptoms on the surface. Like you can look at if it's, let's say it's mental health issues, or it's poverty, or it's crime. Like you can see these as symptoms on a surface, and below that surface, like sometimes in systems thinking, you use the metaphor of the iceberg. But a lot of times we put our attention on what we see. Like we see there's crime happening, or there's, someone is not feeling good, or it's like we have a, pandemic, like whatever it is. And we work on the level of the tip of the iceberg. Like what's the immediate, like when there's a fire and you just try to put out the fire. And that's what we do always, like whatever issue we're dealing with as humans a lot of times. So systems thinking, it's about like, okay, but what's going on like underneath the surface? Like what's the mess underneath, the systemic mess? Like what are the organizations that are involved? Like what are the interactions that are happening? What are the mental models that are underneath? Like what are the cultural paradigms that are underneath? And you work with those in a way on the level of those. So it's cutting through in a way like an individual level and a group level, as in culture, but also a structural level.
Thank you for clarifying this. And now I literally see everything that is below the iceberg. And when we talk about cultures and relationships and mental models,
yes,
and organizational culture, but also ethnic culture, how would you then treat them differently, or disentangle them, or see them as a whole? Because you spoke about a holistic view. Yes. So understanding that this is one, but still interconnected.
Yes. So
in your work, how do you approach such a mess once you're aware of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways. And one of the ways is like object constellations, which was introduced at the Never Done Before festival. So that's a way of like modeling, like asking people, okay, there's a particular issue that we're dealing with. It could be citizen involvement, for instance, like a city's capacity to co-create with their residents. That's a broader question, or it could be something a little bit more specific, like how do we change this particular group's experience in relation to the housing situation? And then you start like asking people, like, who are the actors that have a relevance, like that are involved in creating this experience? What are the relationships between these actors that have an impact? What are the factors as you see it that have an impact? And then you can build almost like a model of like how someone's experiencing, like what are them? And then it's always like like you have to draw a boundary somewhere, but you can start by almost like putting on the table what are the crucial sort of components as you see it. Yes. And then from there, like you can, when you have these models and you start comparing models, like maybe someone has a factor that nobody else thought of, or they highlight a relationship that nobody else thought of. And then you can start seeing, okay, like where can we intervene? How can we intervene in this? And then you can be sort of strategic about where to, depending on, like what sort of capacity or space for action that the particular group is in. So you're not trying to solve something like from the outside in a way, but it's really like, okay, what's my position in this? What's our position in this? What can we do based on this more holistic picture? What can we do, and how can we test a new way forward, or a new new links in a system, a tiny version, a small version. Can we try something? What would that be?
And always starting from the individuals and the roles that are affected in this.
I think, and there's no recipe for it. I think it's like, depending on the situation, you can start in different angles and what kind of mandates that are there for the people who are involved. But you can choose. And I think that's the thing, like when you start like sort of unpacking the mess underneath the surface of the iceberg, you can make like strategic decisions about like, what can we do? But I think it's crucial in a way that this like activation of people's motivations is an essential part of it in a way. Like that's how change comes about, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe sort of just forging new pathways, new links.
Yeah. And to maybe quickly share also for the audience my experience with the workshop. So it was, I think the prompt was to find 3 objects, and one representing ourselves, one representing, I think, the client with whom we're working,
yes,
and another one representing the group that we're about to facilitate. And just by the first exercise was to find a position of where do we stand, literally, in this constellation, who looks at whom and who stands behind whom, already triggered so many emotions, but also insights, I guess, just to bring it out. And I wonder whether, I guess you thought about it, what is the reason behind this being so impactful? Just the representation as objects and moving them around.
I mean, I think one is that it gives us an opportunity to like tap into also our felt intuitive sense of things. I think we're so used to, like, sometimes when people approach these exercises, they're like, oh, they want to make this objective system. And it's like, oh, is it really like this? Is the relationship actually like that? Or is that just my experience? And it's like moving away from that. It's like, in a way, giving validity to your experience, your intuition, like that's valid knowledge. So I think that's one aspect of it, that it gives us that opportunity to really model and make tangible something that can feel like very abstract in a way, or even difficult to communicate, even for ourselves. So I think that's one way. And also sort of putting something out there, like you have a mental idea of something, like I think that it's a creative act in a way. Like suddenly, like this problem that's up here, like in your head, it's on the table. You can point to things, you can show it to other people, you can look at how other people see it, you can compare, contrast, you can point, you can shift. Like suddenly there's this creative opening in a way that I think is very difficult when you're just talking to each other.
Yeah, and I think you suddenly also become a fly on the wall. So you look inside something you're actually maybe too much involved in, and suddenly it's there, and you can almost become an invisible player in this.
Yeah, and I think you can see yourself. I think that's one of the main thing that I want to explore even further. Like, what does it mean? Because normally it's like we're walking around in a way in our bubbles and we see the world through our bubbles. But when you put this on the table, it's like suddenly your inner bubble is right there. You can play with it. Like you can see yourself in relation. You can see almost like your own whatever freedom of movement or agency that is there or is not there. Like you see it. It's almost like I think Augusto Boal, who's a theater director, who's behind Theater of the Oppressed, I think he described it as like the aesthetic space. Like when you step into the aesthetic space, like if you create, like we have a stage, we have a performance, it's like suddenly everything is not so set, so solid anymore. Like there's room to shift, to change. Like there's, like this is a model of something and it can change. It's not the ultimate reality. Like,
yeah, and it's a different way of expression than in the theater, forum theater. I had a podcast interview on forum theater, where basically the participants go on stage and they express certain individuals' roles from their own interpretation, but they almost take this on. So, and it seems like with the object constellation, it brings another layer, maybe of security, because you don't have to put yourself out there immediately.
Yeah, I think that's the trick, because I'm inspired by systemic constellations, for instance, which is normally done with bodies. Mm-hmm. And that comes with sort of its own frame of reference or theory. And I think it's useful, like the way also as a transdisciplinary designer, like that's what I do in a way. Like I never adopt an entire sort of framework of thought and practice, but it's always like, okay, I'm trying to understand something, I'm trying to explore something, I'm trying to facilitate something, and whatever tools I find useful, I adjust them, I appropriate them, and having that is almost like, yeah, if you're speaking about bubbles, it's almost like your location is a little bit like outside of a lot of these bubbles, like even in relationship to design, which is sort of my backbone in a way. Like I'm in constant questioning of the design process, the design methodology. Like there always needs to, like there's this inventive aspect of everything in a way, like depending on the context, the needs, the particulars of the situation.
And I love how you explain it. And I think it's such a gift to have this abundance of different tools and disciplines you can pick and choose from. And I'm just visualizing you as a cook using all these different spices and mixing them together as you use different disciplines. So reading a recipe and applying it is one thing, but reading it and interpreting it using different spices that you might have at hand is something different.
Yeah.
And in the kitchen, if I just continue this picture, there are some spices that marry very well together, and it's just an explosion and creates something new. Whereas others, you maybe try it once, but you definitely not try it again because it just doesn't taste. So back to disciplines. Are there some disciplines that marry very well together and some that don't? And how do you find that out?
I think it's not so much about what disciplines marry well together. I think it's more like, for me, like anything, like again, if I look at my library with like philosophy and psychology and organizational development and leadership literature, like whatever it is, like physics, it's always people who are sort of at the forefront of questioning their own discipline. So I think it's more a matter of like how, to what extent are you inventing your discipline anew in a way, and sort of like drawing, or in what ways am I able to take an existing framework and appropriate it in a way that it sort of pushes the boundaries of what that discipline or whatever I'm trying to explore, like pushing the boundaries of that. Because disciplines in themselves come with a whole range of different approaches to change, to how we see human beings, to, like what we strive for, how we see the world, or how much of the mess that we embrace in a way.
And you mentioned chaos theory and physics. Yeah. Having a book there. To what extent would you, or have you in the past, incorporated this way of thinking, this system, into maybe your facilitative work?
I think the physics stuff that I've been looking at, I mean, there's other people who are looking at it too, like bringing it into, like Karen O'Brien, I've read her books about, like she's incorporating physics into like climate change transformation, and how can like the latest in physics help us see sort of possibility in terms of change in a different ways, that things are not so static, that things are emergent, for instance, that like the butterfly effects, like something happens, like a small thing can have a big impact, and sort of questioning the statistical models of predicting things, like the opening up sort of areas of possibility, which I think the latest physics is sort of questioning our whole worldview as like, because we have like from 16th century Newton physics, we're taught that like the world is this predictable machine. And as long as like if we isolate the parts and we fix them, and also this idea that we can eradicate problems in a way, like we can, declare war on terror or a war on poverty or a war on drugs. And, we have that one mission. We're going to fix this part of the problem. We're going to eradicate. So, like modern physics does not, like that's not sort of reality, the total idea of our reality in a way. So I think like that kind of the latest in science, like natural sciences are sort of supporting this idea that I think many like poets or facilitators or artists know sort of inherently through their work that things are emergent, that there needs to be like things can shift in unexpected ways. Like all processes are not so linear, like there's unexpected, and we have to pay careful attention in a way too, like what are the possibilities, what's emerging in every situation, and work with that emergence rather than trying to steer and predict and control the world. Like that's not how we bring about change. So I think that's,
And what I hear is also embracing the unknown and embracing, or at least entertaining the thought that some things only emerge because we look at them. Some things are only there because there's an observer. If there's no observer, there is nothing.
That's interesting.
Which might also apply to organizations or people, group dynamics. It's sometimes
what you see, I think, sometimes like, I've used the example of like, let's say a great youth leader who walks into a room with a group of young people, like other people might walk into this room and see like, oh, like these are like vulnerable groups on their way to whatever situation, and somebody else might walk in and see that, like they see the conditions that people are living under, but they also see potential, like they see something else and they can draw that out. And I think it's the same, like you walk into like a really messy sort of, the way we've built our organizational structures now that I'm in them, like it's a big mess of sort of policies and roles and mandates and resources and budgets and goals, targets that are set up that are really like steering in all types of directions that are not necessarily serving the people in a way. And I think it's the same thing there, like walk in and then it's like suddenly like seeing like in the in-betweens, you see potential. Like if this part linked with this part and something was done differently, something could happen, like this could happen. And I think that capacity is like, for me, that's part of like the heart of systems thinking in a way, like seeing unexpected potential in the mess, not ignoring the mess.
I like this contradiction to start with the individual or to focus on the individual, but at the same time pulling ourselves out of this mess to look at it from a third perspective. And out of curiosity, when coming back to the system constellations and group work, and when I think of an organization, because from how do you make it a group exercise? Because the constellation, as I experienced it for the first time, was something deeply personal. And yes, we did exchange then with a partner, and just talking about it and explaining the constellation in front of our eyes helped. But how do you then bring it together to make sense of it as a group?
I think I'm still in like exploration mode in terms of that. I think one way of doing it is sort of synthesizing, like if people are looking at the same issue. That's what I've done like in my work in Helsingborg, where we're working with citizen-driven innovation, like where I asked people in the working group to model their understanding from different perspectives. Like they were all public sector employees, but what were their understanding of the systems and the actors and the relations that have an impact on this? So one way I think is sort of synthesizing and showing, like making a map. I made like a visual map of key relational tensions, for instance, between like political leadership and the residents the furthest out, with sort of the people who are more in a operational public sector employees in between, in a way. And that in between, like visualized in that in between position, for instance, and locating yourself in this, seeing this, visualizing this gap, for instance, that came across in all of the workshops, but also adding like the multiplicity of layers and perspectives in the group, like making that one picture in a way and like seeing it all at the same time. I think that's one way of making it a group experience. But I also think, I know I've been in experiences with people who are like pushing sort of the edges of systemic constellations and applying it to more like political, because it has a history of family therapy and then organizational development. And then I've been in more like experimental sessions where where we've looked at climate change, for instance. So that's one way of that I've experienced of doing it as a group exercise, which takes a lot in a way too. I think you can't, like what we discussed earlier, that you need these like entry points to things, that I think to invite people into this full-blown group experience, especially if there are hierarchies and very different perspectives and people are not used to stepping into their bodies, for instance, I think it's a little too quick. So for me, I'm still exploring this. I think how to make it a group experience in contexts where people are not familiar or comfortable necessarily with these types of methods.
And before I dig deeper into this embodied exercise and how to approach it, I just realized that I think in my mental model, when I asked you this question, I somehow thought that we have to bring then all these individual perceptions into one and align and find. And then I realized actually, no, just acknowledging that there are different perspectives and seeing that it becomes a conversation trigger. Why do you see a person in the way between two others or further away than others? Can just open a different kind of conversation than trying to find a general alignment that is impossible because your reality by definition is different than from my reality.
That's a good point. But I think it's an experimentation how you do that, because I've experimented also in the class that I'm teaching with allowing people first to model their own understanding of a particular case that they each chose in every group. And then I asked them to create one constellation together, like what's our shared understanding of something. And that seemed to be a good exercise in that situation also. And sometimes also like encouraging people to include movement, for instance, but to find some way of communicating, like what's our shared understanding. I think it's a good exercise, even though it doesn't have to reach this point of complete alignment of how things are. I think we're so used to like wanting this objective, in a way, we want to know how it is. And
we're still at Newton, right?
Yes, we're still at Newton. And it's like, I mean, again, we have physics from the 1920s who shows that that's not the case. That's not how reality works. Yeah. And I think really like stepping into this sort of, I guess is a bit of an academic term, but like intersubjective space and see what can we create? What can we create? I have this experience perspective. You have this. What can we create? How can we understand each other? And what can we create from here? Like starting to ask those questions rather than, this, someone called it like moving from the knowing paradigm to the growing paradigm. Louis Holtzman, actually, who's a brilliant thinker in psychology, who talked about moving from knowing to growing. And I think that's a mindset that we need to foster, and where maybe these constellations can be a help as well.
Yeah, because the knowing paradigm is just an illusion at the end. And I think that's... And that's maybe the first lesson that we learn as a facilitator, right? That it's, or when we're facilitating, there is no truth. It's just something will emerge from the group. But knowing
and it's true.
I like that.
Hey, Since you are listening to this podcast, I was wondering whether you get enough opportunities to exchange, practice, and experiment with other facilitators. Have you heard of the Never Done Before Facilitation Festival? It's a 24-hour global event that is co-created by its participants and delivered by some of the most popular Workshops Work podcast guests. Visit neverdonebefore.org for more information. Use the code WORKSHOPSWORK to get a 20% discount. The festival starts as soon as you join. Now, back to the show.
And you mentioned the embodiment, and I do hear that it's difficult to confront someone with constellations, object constellations in the beginning. Because although it comes across so playful, naive, it goes deep immediately.
Yeah.
So what would be your approach to introduce it or to loosen people up, to get them more in touch with their bodies? Because at the end, the movement of the object is something that happens from within, where you have to be in check with your intuition, because otherwise it's just your mind of what I think you mentioned that earlier, what makes sense objectively.
Yes.
Instead of what is my own sense of this. How do you get them there?
I think I've been playing with, just like we did, me and Sarah also, one way of doing it, like setting this sort of embodied tone to the whole workshop, like starting off with the question of, I think me and Sarah had this, like, what smell or brings you joy today? And then asking people to check in regularly with their bodies. And I think I can get even better at practicing this, because I also feel like, because it's so, in a way, like the body has been so unbelievably excluded from anything, any kind of public conversation, anything political, anything organizational. It's been so included and made shameful in a way also, like our feelings and our felt sense. In a way, it's been, put in this private sphere. So I think, it's a practice also for me as a facilitator to sort of dare to put the body in the room in a way and validate it. So I think like that aspect of creating a safe space in terms of that is really important. And then play with also like what's private and what's not, and like what's a private exercise. What are we asking people to share, and what is more of their own experience? So that's something I'm playing with a lot too.
When you say that you had to learn and are still practicing to bring your body into the space, I hear that it's not a metaphor. So it's, or is it a metaphor? So what do you mean by that?
Oh, like bringing I think like how we experience, like what we sense, what we feel, for instance, what we see in a particular situation. Like those are questions that have not like been excluded in a way, like all those aspects of, like, that's what I tie to the body, like the things that we sense, the things that we feel, the things that we sort of see on a more intuitive level. So I think that's what I mean with bringing the body into the space. So not just what we think.
Not just the mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And there's room for both, of course, but I think it's just been a lack of balance. I think that's the sort of problem of our time, that there's a lack of balance. We need both.
Yeah.
Both.
I was about to ask the question where you would draw the line between woo-woo and holistic. And what I hear is maybe it's if you exclude the mind and then you go too much into just the body. Is this then the moment where it becomes woo-woo?
I think so. I think that that's a good, for sure. Like we actually did in my studies in New York in transdisciplinary design, we had a project where we were looking at artificial intelligence. And we found that like narratives around artificial intelligence, that they were all centered on sort of left brain qualities of thinking and pattern recognition, and not sort of embodied, intuitive, emotional understanding. And then we were playing with, like, we created two worlds of extreme doing and extreme being. And we had extreme doing, like a super efficient, like goal-oriented, like, again, like the extreme version of sort of the Western paradigm, technologically driven. And then we created this world of extreme being that we inhabited with all these characters who were in this other space where it was all feeling and sensing and almost being submissive in a way, like not exercising any authority or power over anything around you. And sort of showing that none of them, like, they're both not the way to go in a way. Like, we need to find a conversation in between in the way that we do things, in the way that we think about things. So I
love the exercise. I love the exercise, and can imagine by just playing out the two extreme opposites.
Yes.
In any situation, even in group work, I can imagine now if you're working with the team or an organization that are facing struggles, playing out the two different extremes. Yeah. Almost to the ridiculous, to then think, okay, so what is the common ground that we actually need? Yeah, and what's the path we're on if we take it to the extreme? And what's the opposite of that? And like, and what do we, based on that, what do we want to create? Because I think that's the thing also, that we're in these bubbles in a way, and what we see is what we take for granted. Like, that's how it is. But like, sort of inviting people into a space of we constructed this, like everything that we think and do and practice, it's made up stuff. It can be real, like it can be extremely real, because that's what we made, because we believe in it and we practice it. And but it's, at the end, it's made up. We can, which also means we can change it. Yeah. Which gives freedom, but also can be scary. Yeah, for sure. So I can imagine that your background and the studies in New York and doing all these creative exercises with a group of like-minded creative peers can have enriched you and given you the toolbox. And I wonder now, what is your process? Do you have then a group still with whom you would explore and brainstorm to bring new ideas to life? Because I can imagine that when you're used to this plethora of input, creativity, that when you now have to or want to design a facilitated process to solve a problem, how do you go about it? How do I go about it? You mean in the work that I do? Yeah, where do you find the inspiration, or how do you come up with creative exercise? Because I just got a glimpse of it. Oh, yeah. I think it's in response to sort of the question that I'm holding in whatever work I do, because it's always been the questions that have driven, like whatever I'm exploring, that have driven me to explore new mediums. Like when I was in advertising or in graphic design, I mean, this was like maybe 15 years back. And then I was getting into like social progress and social change. And then I would ask questions sort of based on that understanding, like how can we change the image of a marginalized community, for instance, a self-image or the image in the eyes of others. That's what advertising and design is really good at, like that kind of design. And then I would explore that, like building networks around that and giving form to a different vision for this community based on the people in the community that I worked with, for instance. And then, with time, as I get into this more, it's like, oh, but that's not enough. Like we need to go deeper and maybe activate the creativity of people involved. And then I explored cultural festivals. And then later it's like, whoa, but there's all these identities and interactions and relations. It looks like a weird system of like roles on a stage. Okay, I need to go on into performance and explore this. Or it's like I've moved to mural painting, to this organization development. Like I was confronted with a lot of organizational strangeness when I was leading creative processes, for instance, with children and young people. And then I got involved in like organization development, like what's going on with all these people who are so scared with the creativity or the agency of regular people. What did you find? Huh? What did you find? What did you find? What are they scared of? That's a good question.
I think it's funny because I mean, it goes back to, oneself. Like, what do I find scary about these things? And I think it's that lack of control in a way. Like, we're comfortable in our boxes and where people are locked in their places. Like, this group is privileged, this group is marginalized, or this is how we do things. This is how things are done. This is what my role is. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. I think there's a comfort in that. And going outside of that, like, it's a scary thing. It's going back to what you talked about the unknown, being in the space of, in a way, becoming. It's a scary place to be because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know, like, I think a lot of it goes back to, the fear of the things that we don't know.
Yes, and I think there are good reasons why our brain is wired in this way.
Yeah.
And there might be very good reasons why in corporates people tend to be even more afraid of going there. So when you're taking your participants on this journey of, it almost sounds like a discovery of self-expression.
That's interesting. Yeah.
How do you equip them to step outside again? Because you're creating the safe space. I mean, that's your role in this moment, to hold the space.
Yeah.
But at one point, they're leaving it.
Yeah. What
is key to keep it and still move to the other world?
It's interesting. I've had a lot of conversations about this actually with other people who are working in this space. And one of the things I think is almost like bringing in those conditions into this exploration and playfulness and what you're looking at. So you're not creating like this little compartmentalized reality where you're just going through a process that's not linked to any of sort of the restrictions that you're experiencing in your day-to-day. But for instance, with an object constellation, you're modeling all these restrictions and confinements. You're looking at them like they're part of the play in a way. So I think that's a key thing in a way. And that's where what I would call like systemic change in a way, like that's part of what you're playing with.
Makes total sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually, through play, making them ready. So yes, it's a new way of self-expression, but within this world.
Yeah, and I think building, like, I mean, that's what I'm hearing from a lot of participants in these kinds of settings too, that it is lonely to be thinking in new ways and wanting change, but to also build like strong networks. And I think also some sort of frameworks around things, like almost like a language that you can bring with it. Because I think that's the thing too, that, I mean, when I speak about, like jumping into the unknown and our fear of this, like, because it's not like, I'm not, embracing a woo-woo, like, oh, everything is relative and whatever. I think we need structure and we need to create frameworks around these new ways of doing things that are more sort of life embracing or embracing of people's capacities and agencies and creativities that are more just or like pointing in a more sustainable direction. We need frameworks of thought also around these things to create like almost like a stability in it. So I think
who do you mean when you say we?
Oh, let's see, what did I say that we need to? I said that, right?
Yeah.
That's a good question. We, I guess we as change makers, I think, because I mean, we all have different parts to play, but I feel like part of my role in whatever, like evolutionary state that we're in as a species is partly creating some sort of framework and structure around things. Also like enabling conditions in a way, like where our focus is a lot on how do we create conditions to activate people, to forge new links. Like we're not trying to fix the problem, but we need a structure that creates conditions for these things to happen in a way. And what are those structures? I think that's a key question in a way that drives my work also.
Without being dogmatic about it and acknowledging that it changes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's where the community of change makers, facilitators, however you want to call them, becomes so interesting, because everyone comes in with a different background and still using some sort of jargon, like holding space. I think when I started the podcast, holding space, okay, let's try this one on. So I learned all this language that I wasn't familiar with, which now comes natural. But I think for the outside world, it's still jargon, which might sound woo-woo until you really are curious enough to explore what it actually means.
Yeah.
For you, what makes a workshop fail?
I think, well, one thing, if it's too didactic. Another thing, I think, if there's now I'm thinking more like a series of workshops, but let's say if I'm doing a series of workshops and I've planned in detail every single one, what's going to happen in every single one, I think that's like a recipe for failure in a way, that there needs to be this attentiveness to what's emerging, and also like asking for that feedback from the people involved. And ideally this would happen like in a single workshop in a way. I think it's difficult sometimes in the digital space. I mean, it's possible, but it's a little bit harder to sort of pivot and adjust and change in the digital space. I feel like things need to be a little bit more of formulas in a way, because otherwise it's easy that people sort of drift off in their own. But of course, there's ways of doing it in the digital space as well, to sort of ask for feedback and then allow that to change what you present the next time. It's like almost like leading people from a little bit like underneath.
Leading from underneath.
Yeah.
Nice. From what's really there below the tip of the iceberg.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. And I guess seeing people, I mean, this is something I feel like I'm constantly practicing, like seeing people for sort of who they are, or who they are in a particular system, but also for what they are becoming, or for what they have the potential to become.
And I like, well, it's a podcast, so the audience cannot see what you just did with your hands, but it almost looked like this infinite curve.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Horizontal 8.
Yeah, I think I that kind of movement helps me understand it better. It's that movement of like going underneath and then up,
coming back up.
Yeah, and almost also like being active and passive in a space. Like, when are you stepping back, taking things in, and when are you stepping up, sort of pointing in a particular direction? When are you, like, that balance, I think, is crucial.
Yeah.
Just, like everything else with the thinking and the feeling, like, okay, if we sit and sense into our beings the whole time, like, it's not, it needs to be a balance.
Yeah. And maybe unrelated, but maybe related. I was kind of thinking back to embodiment and dance. And then I was wondering, how do you choose the tools that you're using? You shortly mentioned art on mural. So what is art? Yeah. Mural of art.
So, I thought you said that. Okay. Yeah. The time I was doing that.
So when would you choose constellations as opposed to art and drawing, maybe music, maybe dance? I mean, there's so many different media we can use. How do you go about it?
I think it's depending on like what the context is ready for and available to, in a way. Like if I'm working with young people, for instance, in a community house. We can explore all types of like shifts in a way through mural painting, for instance. We can, create a new image of our collectivity, or like, embrace where we are and where we're going in a mural, for instance. But if I'm working with public sector employees, for instance, who have, like more of a strategic, who have their systems, confinements and restrictions and assignment, like whatever it is, then object constellations might be a path. If it's a group of people who are all used to embodiment techniques, then you can go full on and use bodies or whatever you want, like immediately. So I think it's like whatever serves the purpose of the context and what you want to achieve or explore in that context.
And how do you find out? Because I think it's very easy to get trapped in assumptions. So I'm called by the public sector. Okay, I assume they're all bureaucrats and in their little bubbles, but maybe then it's totally different. Or I'm going to a community house believing that they're all artists, but actually they are all behind their screens, caught in computer games and super introverts.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. It's a good point to be wary of those expectations. I think it's normally I do take, I lay low for a bit in different contexts that I'm entering before I even think of what I'm supposed to be doing there or why this would work. I think I always, in a way, like take the time to understand and see or sense into where people are at, and understand what's important to people. Like, what are the questions that are important to them? Like, sort of what's, even as a social space, like what feels like appropriate or not. Or I think I'm always sensing into that before I introduce anything in particular. So that's part of it, I think.
Not surprised.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
But no, I mean, I do think like these constellations, I think you can use them in any context, where it's like, that's at least what I'm going to be exploring a bit, because I do think it's something that can be appropriated in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the way how you explained it in the beginning of our conversation is also might be an easy way in for someone to just try it out and see what happens, even without making it the full focus. What would be your warning if someone wants to try out object constellations for the first time? What would be the red flags, or, please don't do that?
Yeah, some of the red flags would be maybe because I think there's a risk of getting into this space of like thinking again, like now you understand the system in a way, like sort of like drawing too many conclusions from things in a way. I think that's like, could be a warning signal. And also, I mean, when I've experimented with it myself, like you can get easily overwhelmed sometimes also, like taking in, when I've done a first round of constellations with this working group in Helsingborg, I was completely overwhelmed with just the intricacies of like the complexity of the simple question, like what are the systems involved in the city's capacity to co-create with their citizens. And I think since then I've gone more towards like really like locating and grounding in whatever position that people are in a way. And then what can we do from there? Or like with a particular group of people, what can we activate in this space? So I think that's one. I mean, I think that's systems thinking in general, that you can get overwhelmed when you open up to the complexities of things. So staying grounded in it, I think, is something you need to be mindful of. And I think I think there needs to be communities of people looking at complexity, because I've personally spent a lot of time like just absorbing complexities of the systems that I've been involved with. And I think there needs to be communities looking at complexities together and creating something from it. that's how you sort of overcome the overwhelm.
Because complexities I guess they're all unique in some sense, just because every organization is different. But there are patterns that help us to approach them.
Yeah. But I feel like no one should be left alone with, all of this complexity.
And I think one of my early podcast guests, Mark Lamberts in Germany, he has worked a lot on complexities and all these systems connected.
That's
Could
nice.
be interesting.
Maybe I should listen to that podcast.
Very early days.
Yeah.
Is there anything, since you're approaching the hour, is there anything that you have the impression that you would like to share that we haven't touched yet?
Maybe just like maybe wrapping up in a way, like one thing that feels important, I think, is to, like, if I think of facilitating, to allow sort of the purpose or the exploration to guide whatever tools, frameworks, theories, whatever it is that you're drawing from in it. Yeah, I think that's key. To step into the space of like the in between of the different frameworks and resources and identities. Even I'm a facilitator, or I'm an educator, I'm an artist. Like, to dare to be in that in between space and allow sort of the exploration to guide who you are in that particular moment, what tools you use, how you approach people. I think, I don't know, maybe that's something I want to leave people with.
Which basically answers the question that I would have asked afterwards. What would you like someone to remember who missed the entire show and just woke up? So that's usually my last
maybe
question.
That's it. Maybe that's it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your systemic view on facilitation. It was truly enriching.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention, as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.